I thank each one of you for coming and participating in this meeting. I hope you find it fruitful. We have a diverse bunch of people, from industry professionals to academic researchers to students, and this space becomes important to have conversations about HCI. My name is Divya, and I'm a first year MDes interaction student from IDC School of Design, IIT Bombay, and I would be your host today. In today's meeting, we have three presenters who are presenting three very interesting topics. The first presenter is Mr. Amit Patil, the second is Mr. Aman Parnami, and the third is Mr. Ashutosh Shembekar. I'd first like to present Mr. Amit, and he's going to talk about artificial intelligence and workplace behaviors. Briefly introducing Amit, he's a curious wanderer, father, poet, and has been a UX professional for the last 13 years. Currently, he manages a team of designers around workplace intelligence in Microsoft. Previously, he has worked for companies like Honeywell Aerospace, IBM, and multiple startups. While trying his hand at publishing a few patents and papers, his interest lies in applying research within the industry. So, over to Amit now.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to hide this dialog box, which is taking. So, hi everybody. Glad to have all of you here, and thanks for the lovely introduction. I think it's great to be part. And Anuruddh sir, as in I've been one of your students. I know you must have had so many students that specifically remembering me wouldn't be that easy, but yeah, we always remember you. So, starting with the topic, as in the topic is something that is very close to my heart around AI and workplace behaviors. And I started with the inquiry of, how might we use power of AI to empower employees and organizations. And what I would like to ask, so this is how basically I'm going to talk through. I'm going to touch upon all of these topics in a short period of time. What I'm going to ask all of you today is to, for a moment, think like a CEO or a chief executive officer or chief business owner or a business decision maker of your company. The reason that I'm asking you to do that today is because I'm going to talk about organizations or workplaces. And we all are part of workplaces, a place where we go to work, a factory, an office, a school, college, depending on the nature of your work. And of course, you have to make sure that you go to work to pay your bills. But these workplaces don't magically work. There's some reason how they work. If you go by traditional definition, organizations are a group of people with a purpose. So this fits in everything from family, schools, to governments, or to organizations which are corporates. And you can't deny that you are part of one. And these organizations are complex creatures, and they're becoming ever large complex every day. There are multinationals with connectivity, with internet. We are going cross-country, cross-cultural, cross-product, cross-industry. Some organizations cover a lot of segments around industries as such. And that's making them incredibly complex to handle as well as operate. But I'm going to try and simplify it today, because what makes each of these organizations unique? Every organization says that, hey, we are not like the other company, our competitors are different, and so on. So let's try to look at it from a very simplified lens. Maybe the purpose and the process. Every organization has a purpose. That could be one of the elements that actually makes that organization unique. Some organizations have a very, social responsibility type purpose. Some organizations have a very business-oriented purpose. Or the tools and the products that they use. So organizations actually run on a lot of tools, and each organization has its own unique set of combinations of tools. The Zoom software itself is like a tool for us right now. And there are products that are produced by using those tools. So there's something that comes out by the end of the day, and that's what the organization sells and gets money from. But the most important part of an organization are its people. And there's no denying that. In the end, an organization runs because the people actually put in those hard-earned days, nights, and actually make this happen. People like us who actually work on products, towards a purpose. So if you try to add it up, it's people, tools, and process that make the product which is purposeful and is sold. But life is not that simple, because if this was like the formula for organizations, then all organizations would be run really smoothly. People just don't use tools to produce the products directly. They actually talk to other people and then work with other people. It's a human nature to come together and make things happen. And that's the beauty of it, because as and when people come together, they form work patterns. Every individual, in the way they use the tool, and the tool could be a digital tool, a physical tool, or any sort of methodic tool, which is used to make sure that the work is done. But each of those actually tools, irrespective of how fixed or rigid that tool is, individuals or human beings have a way to use it, and that forms the pattern. And these work patterns tell a lot about your company culture. Because in the end, when you actually use those tools to connect with each other or make that final purpose of your company or the product of your company happen, you actually start forming a culture, a work culture. And I'm not just talking about the water cooler gang culture, but also from a very formal way of how do we work and how do we make things happen. Here's a Dilbert, which explains some of the culture, and some of you might recognize this. Meetings is a big headache. Meeting cultures is something that we all want to stay away from. And the Dilbert clearly says, you have a pre-meeting of the pre-meeting of the pre-meeting, and let's decide in this meeting what we'll do in the next meeting, and so on. But there are multiple ways in which you can actually see these cultures coming out. There are late night calls culture. There's expect a response now culture, or don't interact with the customers often culture, or even presentation culture. Like, hey, make a presentation for that, then I'll think about this. And ironically, these tools actually can recognize those cultures. And as Peter Drucker famously said, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So organizations cannot thrive by ignoring the culture of the organization. They have to know what is the culture of the organization. And the challenge is these cultures actually, they are fixed norms. This is a HBR study which actually puts organizations in different quadrants on the basis of their culture. And it's interesting how they've actually figured out certain parameters to actually identify what organizational culture could be. And again, there are lots of definitions out there. This is a subject which has people can do PhDs on. But this particular paper found out one interesting fact that irrespective of your industry, geography, type, size, there are two things that remain constant. That's people interactions and response to change. And that's how that four-way grid is being formed, because people interactions is a very critical facet to organizational cultures. And these days we interact digitally. Ideally, in an organization, we think that people interact in this fashion. This is how the organization works. There's a boss, there's a team, and then that boss has another boss, and then that boss has another boss, all the way up to the CEO. Let me tell you, that's not how the organizations work. This is how the organizations work. Although the structural construct of an organization is in a particular fashion with roles and responsibilities and the way in which you are reporting to somebody, that's exactly not how organizations work. And the recent research, this area is called organizational network analysis, tells you more about how people interactions change the way information is transferred or passed around in the organizations. Say, for example, this one. If you say group A and group B used to interact with each other through this one individual, and this individual could be anybody. It need not be the boss of that group. It could be a side person. It could be a new joinee. It could be an old person. But what happens when such an individual reduces working, stops working, or possibly leaves the organization? Suddenly, there's this gap in the organization. And imagine this, and I've tried to oversimplify this, but imagine this across the organization, crore, multi-million dollar organizations across the world connecting with each other, groups connecting with each other in a particular fashion. And that is why people interactions need to be studied more evidently and so on. But then how do we recognize what's the company's culture? How do we recognize all these things? And how do they happen today as such? And it's a tough challenge because either we ask the employees, that's where the annual survey goes out and you actually click on, yes, I agree to this, I don't agree to this, there's a 5-pointer and things like that. And employees actually specify what they feel like. Then there's the asking the managers. The managers are like the shining knights in the armor where they actually tell you, hey, my team is very good. Or hire consultants. The problem with the first one is our typical user research problem, what Margaret Mead has said, and most designers would recognize this. What people say, what people do, and what people say they do are very different things. So when you put across a survey to individuals, everybody tries to think very differently, and they don't really do what they say always. As I'm not saying everybody lies, but then you can't articulate everything that you do. Or asking the managers. Now, this is an interesting book, if you can get hold of it, Reinventing Organizations, which actually identifies, hey, asking the managers depends on how your organization is shaped up with respect to the managerial structure. Is your organization impulsive, where you have clear division of labor and you have a top-down authority, you will do this work from this point to this point? Or is it in a traditional org structure manner, where you actually you have replicable processes? You have a king and his set of followers and so on? Or do you have achievement culture where whoever is doing well goes up higher and so on? And that will actually depend on how they are reporting out of their teams and so on. Or you have open culture, or you are a flat culture of sorts. So it depends on that and so on. And I'm not saying these methods have never worked, but artificial intelligence as a tool, as a way in which we can help us look at this whole organizational culture aspect in a very interesting fashion. And it can actually help us. It can actually help us identify the work culture. AI, as we all know, has a lot of things that it can do. And we always know AI by just bots and the speakers that we have at home, or some sort of scientific research, or some sort of Siri talking to you. But if you generalize, there's one area which AI is great at. It's identifying patterns. And guess what? There are patterns. We talk about work patterns. How, if we make our tools intelligent enough and help identify the work patterns that are being used over a period of time, like how many times I'm blinking in this Zoom meeting, or how many times there are pauses and so on. There's a lot of data that is collected in this. And that's when we actually try to make it, or boil all this over a period of time, all these tools, if you actually boil over it over a period of time, you identify the ways in which people work. And that's the beauty of it. We can be told by our tools how we work. And this is not new, as in we're seeing a part of it in when we are our phones are telling us you're using your screen too many times, or our watches are telling us, hey, you're not drinking water, and so on. And many times in the organizational structure, there are a lot more things that can be identified. For example, the one example I gave you was if an organization has one person who is connecting two people together, two groups together, and if that person leaves, does that team go in silo? If a manager is not having one-on-ones with their reportees very often, or how often employees are collaborating with each other, whom are they collaborating? And how many of them are working after us? I think this is becoming a modern day problem. In fact, in our product, what we have recently found after COVID is that the way in which collaboration has been going on has changed dramatically. And if you can see these numbers where the percentage of employees collaborating is increased big time, and also the work week span, as we call it, as if the work week span is nothing but the number of hours you work in a day has increased. If you see team 8, it's literally on the verge of a burnout, because it's 55% increase in the work week span. It's actually increasing the number of, so and possibly you're working from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and you're not even realizing it. Even the employees can be shown the same data. It doesn't have to be just organization level thing. The employees can be shown data like, hey, how many meetings do I take in a week or a month? and how much time goes in emails or chats and so on. And this can help you. It's almost like a Fitbit of your work behavior, where you understand, hey, I'm spending too much time in meetings. Maybe I should not spend too much time in meetings. Or maybe people ping me on chat at 3 p.m. always. That seems to be my prime time. Maybe I should just go away from the screen at that time, or maybe tell people not to ping me. So once you know that the pulse of the organization using all this, and maybe you make these intelligent tools or make your tools, existing tools, intelligent with the signals, then how do you drive change in those organizations? So in the traditional fashion, learning sessions, upgraded tools, or change in strategy were the ways in which they did change management. Change management is a topic again in the PhD space as such, where there's lots to study. But if you divide change management in a simplified manner, and this is a good chart I picked up from one of the websites, is that change management can be divided into IT change management, strategy change management, and the people management or people change management. The thing is, mostly this change management has been sitting in the 1 and 2 of the world. And the only way in which the third one has been done is learning sessions, putting people in classrooms, taking them out of the context. The challenge is, if we take people out of the context, they are not really learning in that context. Learning in context has its own value. And guess what? Guess what? Our AI, our technology of AI actually has that capability to identify and react to context. That's another plus point of AI, which can study context, it can study the environment and react to the context. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the concept of nudge. Nudge, basically Richard Thaler, one of the Nobel laureates, actually has written a beautiful book called Nudges. It's an economic theory. It's basically a nudge theory in economics, where he got a Nobel Prize for that. A nudge is basically, from change management perspective, an intervention that gently steers individuals towards a desired action. So it's a way in which you can actually make people do a good thing over a period of time. And of course, a bad thing also is possible. That's called dark patterns on the other side. For example, some of these examples you must have seen around the world, like most guys will recognize the top right picture where you aim at the right place, or tissue papers, or even the escalator thing, right? You walk in one place as against you stand somewhere, the plastic bags and so on. There are multiple types of nudges, but if you just summarize, there's the smart defaults, which is basically you change the default option. There's the increased salience, where you make one option more prominent. And there's the social proofing, where you say, hey, 30% of the people tend to do this more often than you do. Some examples that can be done in software with nudging is you can nudge people by changing the default meeting time. For example, by default, you have a 30-minute time. But if you identify as a culture, the meeting culture is like people are actually having a lot of meetings. And if you at an organizational level change the meeting to 25 minutes, then the default will be absorbed by a lot of people. And what happens eventually is the meeting time starts reducing. Similarly, you can nudge people by not sending mails at the wrong time. For example, it's 9 p.m., 9 a.m. at your time, but because the world is global, like the companies are connected globally, you're about to send that email, but the recipients might not be in the same time zone. So you can get an option to delay send. You can send this afterwards. The AI takes care of sending it afterwards. You just tell, okay, because maybe the AI has identified that you tend to disrupt people very often. And that's basically how you could actually identify the culture as well as make changes. And I've been working on products like these for last 2 years, and I would particularly point out that the challenges in making such experiences as such. And of course, I'm sure by now most of you have talked about privacy. I'll go there, but before you go to privacy, one big challenge for working on such products is validating the experience by itself, because every person sees a different information, because it's on the basis of the context that the information is being shown to you, the nudge is being shown to you, the information for the organization is being shown. And no two organizations, like I said, are similar, are same. So how do we test that? And a lot of work has been going on. If you find the researchers around how do we do it? One way of doing it is like what we have followed is, have a quick and easy, quick and dirty working prototype out there and let people actually use it and give the feedback over a period of time. So feedback becomes a very critical facet in your product design, where however the user can give you feedback more often, the system learns more often, and then reinforcement learning comes sets in. And now I'll go to the topic which I think by now most of you are thinking in the back of your minds, because of we talking about AI, studying people, thinking about people. Big brother, we have this fear of, hey, if you're watching me, and this is the 1984 classic George Orwell Big Brother, but I think there's always a fear that my company is watching me, the company is watching my whatever activities and so on, and perhaps they can fire me for this, and I start changing my way of working because of that. There's a particular psychological effect where if somebody's watching you, you tend to behave in a very different fashion. So this is a big issue and big concern, because even if somebody is watching you for your own good, uh, it could be something which is taking away your privacy. And privacy is not an option, it's mandatory. And hence, within our AI systems, we have tried to intricately put in these values and many such values, like make sure that the AI cannot identify an individual employee for evaluation, for automated decision making, or even profiling and monitoring. So an organization cannot say this one individual was not doing this in particular fashion or not having their meeting hours regular. It's only a group aggregate that is shown at the organization level. So they can never identify this particular person. So we are taking care of those things. We add noise at times, that's for differential privacy and many other things. And another major feature is the opt-in opt-out. You can choose, I don't want to be part of this. You can be choosing the nudges. The nudges should never be manipulated. Nudges should be in a suggestive manner. And the inclusiveness, whenever you're training these kind of AIs, you have to make sure that the data set that is given to the AI is pretty inclusive. It's considering all the segments, because AI in the end is a monkey which is trained over a given amount of data. And if that data is not diverse enough, then it's going to start having stereotypes. So these are some ways in which we make sure that the privacy is maintained as well as inclusiveness is taken care. There are more guidelines around responsible AI that Microsoft has. You can go through it. In fact, even Google has those, and a lot of other companies are getting a lot of these dedicated AI committees. Ethics becomes a very critical facet around it. Also, for designers, there are dedicated guidelines for human AI interaction. There are some amazing papers. I just linked it here. I'll maybe share this later. And how to do it. There's also some apps around empowering business and using AI for the best. So one of these apps has been mine. So with that, I think I'll stop speaking. I've spoken continuously, and maybe Divya or Pratiti, as in how do we go about the question answer part? That's my
Thanks, Amit. That was really insightful. So if you have questions, you can either raise your hand. There's an option on Zoom, or you can put it in the chat box, and then we can take it forward. We have 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for the talk. It was lovely. So actually, I wanted to ask about the reliability of systems after a random set of people opt in and opt out of. I mean, for privacy reasons or whatever reasons, they sort of start opting in and opting out of, being tracked or whatever. So then probably that sort of just throws off the AI completely, because there is probably some self-selection mechanism in the people who opt in and opt out. I mean, if you just sort of typically look around us, there's some people who are extremely conscious about their privacy and some people who are not. And there is a pattern in that in itself, right? And then when you add that pattern onto the other patterns that you're trying to look at, and then if you have only opted, I mean, only if you're only looking at data of people who have opted in, then doesn't that actually throw the patterns off the real patterns?
So that's very much true, and that's very much true with surveys. I think that's a good point that you brought in. That's very much true with surveys as well. Sometimes when you actually send in those surveys, a lot of people choose not to answer, and organizations don't get the real feel of it. So it's an open issue. The way they try to solve it, and it's a very engineering problem also, as well as a design problem, where the one of the ways they try to solve it is actually try to identify what are the signals which are in the privacy space, like getting your actual content, versus what are the signals which do not need the opt-in opt-out with respect to you're regularly sending emails and there's just a traffic, like for example there's internet traffic out of your router. Your router company is already monitoring it, but you're not given the option of whether you are going to be opting in or opting out. So that's one way where generic signals versus specific signals are separated out, and that's where you actually get to see which signals make a more impact. Also, if the total sample space is very small, the data is not shown. So for example, in a certain space, if the confidence of a particular area, like manager one-on-one interactions, and all maybe 80% of the managers in my company say that, hey, I don't believe in this, I just want to get out of this, then people, that particular area will not be showcased in your dashboards, and because there's not enough data, instead of calculating erroneous data. But yeah, it's an open problem. It's an open problem with respect to, you need participation for making these things happen. If there's no participation, it's not very much possible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there's Malay. He wants to ask a question. So
Yeah, Malay, hi.
Yeah, my question was about, so you gave examples of how you can program nudges for specific people. I mean, depending on the context and so forth, basically context aware nudges. How, so I was thinking, how can we transfer these nudges into real life situations or say natural settings? Because although people do work on computers and such, but let's say, for example, people do interact in cafeteria as well. So do you think that nudges, nudging them over in their personal or natural settings might help in increasing their productivity or achieving companies' goals differently? How would it affect?
So it's a very good question, Malay. Thank you for asking that. In fact, in his book, in Richard Thaler's book, he actually mentions about these natural settings type of nudges, for example, to push yourself towards healthy eating and so on. So it's very much possible. Natural settings are still used by your company. You might not know, but there are certain nudges purposefully put in your cafeteria. Certain TV channels are put in the cafeteria, which are certain, it's called choice architecture, where you actually are given those choices which you don't realize are affecting you. Everything around you is affecting. Advertising is a big example of that. So yes, that is very much possible. The only challenge is, yes, in the software space, we never promise, and any software cannot promise to be comprehensive, exhaustive in making a change. Because you are humans in the end, we move from one place to the other. Unlike, of course, current situation in COVID, what has happened is because the natural settings have gone away and everything has become digital, it's become a very interesting problem to solve, because we are getting more signals. We can identify more data and nudge more people. But this is not, and hopefully this is not the thing that happens forever. So it's not a fully controllable way. It's not like one solution for everything, but it's something that can actually contribute to your greater spaces. So natural settings, always up to it. Like maybe, in fact, a lot of those examples that I showed you, like social engineering is something that they do, like the social scenarios where people tend to throw garbage in the wrong places and so on. So there's a lot of experiment around it. In fact, UK has a department around voice architecture, and they work on that. So good question.
okay, then we have a question by Sudha Guri. The question is, do you see any limitations with AI which hinder our regular activities which exist today?
A lot. AI is not yet grown up to a level where I would say humans can think. Humans are still in the loop. So humans cannot be ignored. It's like you are human first. AI is supporting you. That's something that we have to keep in mind. AI is not there to replace humans. I was about to put that screenshot, which if you search on Google or Bing, so it's like, how will AI? And you'll always say, take over my job. And you see those options and like people are worried about that. AI today has not evolved enough. And even if it does evolve, in the end, what we need to remember is humans are more important. Humans still have the creative zeal to actually do things which AI will only support or assist. And hence, when we design these technologies, we have to be very cautious.
Thank you, Amit.
I see one interesting question. Divya, Pranjal Rai has put in the chat, and
Yeah.
I am very keen to answer that because I think in the current situation of what is happening in US, I think that's a very important thing. So he's asking, I'll just repeat the question, is like, I have a question on privacy perspective. Not many are aware that they are privacy and aware of their privacy, and in that, how can design nudge users to think about their privacies? But if design starts nudging users to think about their privacies with the business model hindered in this case. Brilliant question, Pranjal. I think this is the need of the hour. It goes back to what I said, organizations and the purpose. What is the purpose of an organization and what does an organization want to do? If the organization is very positive in their purpose, then they will never hide the privacy fact of it. And in fact, it's okay to tell people, it's like, you have this privacy option as such, but a lot of people are open. There's also this side of the world that actually is open to go ahead and take stuff or take data from my phone because I know what you're taking. So privacy has a very thin line where you actually have differential privacy. There's something called as differential privacy where things are not actually completely taken off. For example, there's a beautiful sketch. There's a comic book made by Google on differential privacy where they identify how your models are, the data models are actually taught inside your phone, but that same whole model is not sent to the server. It is only the learning that is sent to the server. So there are ways in which you can educate people about privacy around that. So yes, it depends on the purpose of the company, but sadly, and again, I feel sad to say that a lot of companies don't want to do what you are saying there. They don't want to actually showcase privacy as like, hey, this is there and we are taking it. They don't want to do that. So yeah, that's a concern.
There are a couple of more questions. Amit, you have like about 4 minutes left, so you can choose how you can manage the time. There are a lot of questions. So one question was, thank you. Could you please indicate if CDO should also be knowledgeable of AI, which is Chief Design Officers?
Very much. Why not? I would say CDOs should be knowledgeable because I see CDOs are synthesizers. CDOs are actually connecting the C-suite together. The big problem, and I've studied C-suite people, and the big problem in C-suite most of the times they are isolated from each other. Finance guy thinks about finance, a sales guy thinks about sales, and the CEO is supposed to actually help execute everything together, or COO is supposed to execute everything together. But a CDO could actually make sure that things are envisioned in the right fashion. In fact, I feel we should also have a chief ethics officer. That's also very critical.
Okay, there's one more question which says, till what extent AI will penetrate or help in UI development and UX process? Also in the research phase.
Oh, this is, again, this is a classical AI will take my job away question, I think. But it's penetrating already. And I think it's already, we have systems which are auto-generating layouts. But see, AI can generate things. AI cannot select things. Remember, in the end, the contextual accuracy of a particular space can best be done, at least till now, by humans. So it has started coming in the UI development process. On the research side, there are positives of AI. Again, I don't know why we always see AI as this villain with like red color face and like two horns. But AI also has this positivity. If you use that weapon in a particular fashion, you could do user research in a very effective manner, where contextual research can be done in a very effective manner, where you identify the places you should be visiting before even visiting those places. So,
Okay, I think this is the last question that we can take, and that says a related question to you. What about what Malay asked? How do you collect data in such naturalistic settings like cafes, meeting rooms, and ensure privacy? In case of collecting data from tools, you can collect anonymous data, but not necessarily in natural settings.
oh yeah, and that's true. And you could actually do data collection. Like there's one company that actually gives people iCards which recognize your voice wherever you go. That's the rate at which people are trying to collect data, and people are okay in the company to wear that because your words are not captured, but your frequency of voice, the way you are actually talking, how many times you're talking is considered. But you could also do things like camera detection. Like you don't have to recognize the person, but it's like infrared. Does that person come here? Did many people come here in the cafeteria, and so on. The noise detection of that cafeteria. The noise levels will go high when you have people in there. Carbon dioxide in that space, oxygen in that space. There are hundreds of insights, signals that can be generated out of a space in a room, and so I think it's very much possible. In fact, it's a great space, and Malay and others, you should start working towards it.
Right. I think we are up with time. So if anyone has more questions, please feel free to get in touch with Amit in person, and maybe that can create a new conversation. Thank you so much, Amit. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting.